Hey everyone, and welcome to our Modern Sales Pros Virtual Summit Race Through to 22 keynote session. Couldn't say it, 2022. All right, today's event is brought
Say
to
that
you by
5 times fast, okay, Gina?
I
Can you?
know,
Can
I'm
you?
so
Next
sorry.
time.
No, that would just be horrible. Today's event is brought to you by the team at Modern Sales Pros. And for those of you who are not familiar, Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest and highest quality revenue leadership community. Our mission is to create an environment for our members to answer the questions that they'd otherwise struggle to solve on their own. For those of you who aren't members yet, welcome, and you'll be invited to join MSP after the summit, and I really hope that you will join. All right, so this summit would not be possible without our amazing partners who you see on this slide. So snaps, kudos, claps for all of them for making this happen. These partners are not only sponsoring this specific event, but all 3 days of this summit. Race Through to 22 has been all about annual planning and how you can set your teams up for success in the new year. This is the second day of our summit, and this is actually the second event of the day. So pretty soon we'll get into the keynote, and later today we have a fantastic masterclass on how to fix your commission structure. And then tomorrow we have another set of amazing events. So here is the agenda link that I'm going to put in the chat right now so that you can not miss any of our events. We'll also put all of the recordings for our past events there, so you can consume all the content you need. And before we dive into the content, of course, we have some housekeeping notes. So first, this event is going to be recorded. You'll be able to access the recording and the key takeaways on the summit page of our MSP website. Secondly, if you have a question for our speaker, please do use the Q&A function below so that we can get them answered live. Also, this chat is open, so please do interact with each other. What did you think about a point that was just made? How did that affect you at your organization? Definitely let us know. So for the agenda today, we have a quick and fun little appetizer before we get into the main course of the keynote. We're going to start with the state of modern sales pros, and then we'll get into Michelle's keynote on building an agile sales force, which we're really excited for. And then hopefully we have some time at the end for some Q&A. Okay, so let's get into it. So here to present the state of MSP, we have myself. I'm Gina Hawley, Community Manager and Team Lead at Modern Sales Pros. Joining me, a man who needs no introduction, we have Pete Kazanji, founder of Modern Sales Pros. Pete, how you feeling today?
I'm hanging in there. I'm back to back, but the rest of the day. But I'm pumped on Michelle's presentation here. Super juiced on it.
Yeah, that's going to be the highlight. So why don't you introduce yourself and then get us started with the past, present, and future of MSP.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Pete Kazanji. I'm the founder of Modern Sales and also Atrium, a software company that makes data-driven sales management software. Prior to Atrium and Modern Sales, I started a recruiting software company called TalentBin that was acquired by Monster Worldwide in 2014. And so the kind of starting TalentBin and taking it to market was where I kind of cut my teeth with respect to early stage sales, modern sales, kind of process excellence sales, where I went from being a product marketer and product manager previously to being a business generalist founder to a our first rep, sales manager, sales leader, etc. And so I wrote a book on early stage sales called Founding Sales that essentially just encapsulates all of that experience and kind of makes it easier for people who are in a similar situation who haven't done sales before and now have to. And kind of one part of that that kind of came out of that experience was this recognition that there wasn't resources necessarily for like live resources for for early stage sales leadership, founders, sales operations, what have you, early, mid, and growth stage, for folks to kind of answer each other's questions. Because it turns out that, especially in a, you know, an organ like a 50-person or a 10-person organization or a 50-person organization or even a 200-person organization, oftentimes there's not that many other people in that organization who have the same problems that you have as a director of sales development, or a director of sales operations, or a sales operations manager, or what have you. And and that can be a bummer, because many of these problems that people have, that we run into day to day, someone else has solved them already. Right? And so the insight there was that if we could create a community that it started out, MSP started out doing offline events, kind of started out like more traditional meetup-y, where there's like panel talks and what have you. But then what we quickly iterated towards was this roundtable approach, where, because what people really wanted to hear was, they wanted to have structured conversation around specific topics and questions that were relevant to them, and then hear other people's perspectives. Like, oh yeah, we solved that by doing XYZ. We solved that by doing ABC. And then, of course, we added a forum component to it as well. And, that just like makes it so much easier for people to kind of ask questions and get them answered from other folks. And so that's kind of like where MSP came from initially. And so what was kind of crazy was how crazily MSP grew. It started out, I think the first, offline event in San Francisco was like 30 people in the First Round Capital offices. And then what we started getting larger in San Francisco, and Eventbrite hosted us, and Lever hosted us, and Slack hosted us, and so on and so forth. And we would have 50, 100, 150 person events, again, all these just kind of focused on roundtables. And then we started doing it across the nation. We started doing it in New York and Boston and Seattle and Portland and any place, because it turns out there's sales leaders and sales operations folks and sales enablement folks in all these places, and they want to network with other folks, and they want to get their questions answered. And so the community really grew pretty substantially there. And then what was kind of fascinating was this really annoying pandemic showed up, and we then pivoted entirely to virtual events like this, right? And so what's kind of amazing about that is that just super juiced our growth even more. And I think Gina is going to talk a little bit now about kind of like the state of MSP as related to those various metrics.
Yeah, so thanks, Pete. Love to hear that story. But before the pandemic, as he was saying, our events were 90% in person. Our team used to travel to 16 cities around the US and Canada to meet our members. I think the largest event that I went to was over 200 people in San Francisco. So really loud, salespeople like to talk, and they're drinking and eating food, it was fun. But since then, we've pivoted to a completely digital community. Yes. Very party. Hope to get back to it one day.
Soon enough.
But I wanted to share these stats with everyone. So it's really interesting to see the numbers. We're all data driven. So right now we have around 25,000 members. They're all managers and above in revenue related disciplines. And we're definitely growing every single day. On our Google group, our members asked 504 questions, revenue and career related questions over this past year, and got 6,000 answers and replies. That's a lot of members helping members. We like to see it. We hosted about 150 digital events, a ton, which had almost 14,000 RSVPs and nearly 6,000 attendees. This equates to almost 4,000 minutes of high quality content with an average of 4.5 out of 5 stars. So that survey that we always send after an event? Yes, we actually read those. So please do tell us your thoughts. And lastly, I think many of you have attended an MSP wine tasting. So as a whole, we've consumed 3,500 ounces of wine, which equates to 700 normal pours. So I just wanted to say, nice work, everyone.
Well done.
All right. Yes, well done. So here's the breakdown of our community members. Not surprisingly, most of our members reside in the San Francisco Bay Area, with New York City as a runner-up. And the highest percentage of job titles that we have are in the sales and revenue operations and general sales leadership. So I'm sure it's interesting for you all to see stats like this. Next, it's also not a surprise that the majority of our members are in the SaaS industry, and over 50% of our total membership work at companies with over 50 employees. Have something to add there, Pete?
No, not at all. I love it.
Awesome. Yes, it's very cool. So, super high growth companies, people who are working really fast. All right, so I love this slide. These are the lovely ladies behind the glory that is Modern Sales Pros. Every delightful experience that you've had at MSP, whether it be a subject line that made you chuckle, a digital panel where you learned something new, a luncheon where you met someone that you now currently work with, this fantastic and operationally excellent summit that you're currently experiencing. It's all due to the thought, vision, and care of the ladies here. So next time you get an email from one of them, take 2 seconds to reply and let them know how awesome they are and how much this community means to you. So thank you, Elizabeth, Taylor, Nora, Hannah, for all your dedication and your amazing work. Everyone appreciates it. And next to our amazing sponsors. I mean, we wouldn't be here without our amazing sponsors. Since 2015, we've partnered with 90 different thought leading vendors to bring you the best possible content, events, and general member experience. If any of you are listening in from these companies, thank you. We love working with you. And if any of you listening in wants to become an MSP sponsor, send me an email, gina@modernsaleshq.com. I'd love to talk to you. And special shout out to those highlighted in red. They're the sponsors of the summit that you're enjoying right now, and we love it. Next up, special shout out to my girl, Julie Greenfield, head of revenue enablement at Central Square. She is our current top nominator of the year. Julie is also a DE&I committee member and MSP expert. So hats off to you, Julie, for bringing in 9 high quality MSP members so far this year. But the year isn't over. Everyone still has a chance to compete for this top prize. So here's the link to nominate your friends. If you have other awesome revenue leaders who you think would benefit from joining MSP, let them know. Let's get them in here. And lastly, before we get into the keynote, which I know you're all waiting for, thank you to Pete for creating Modern Sales Pros and building the foundation for what our community has become. Our team is dedicated to making sure that MSP is the destination for revenue education, and we're committed to providing you with the highest quality, most relevant, and entertaining content to help you with your career goals. So thanks for coming along for the ride. And with that, Pete, I'm going to hand it off to you to introduce Michelle and get the keynote started.
Oh man, I am so excited for this. So I'll let Michelle, excuse me, I'll let Michelle give a little bit more of a deeper background, but I'm definitely having a fanboy moment where Michelle's writings, along with her her research partner Jason Jordan, has really revolutionized the industry. And advance the state of the art of sales management. The prior book, of course, is Cracking the Sales Management Code, that I can never shut up about. We've probably sent out like probably 2,000 or 3,000 copies to customers and prospects and whatever. It really kind of broke through the concept of that you could use data to instrument and manage sales organizations. I'm currently partway through Michelle's new book, Crushing Quota, which is even cooler because it kind of puts a human component on it. And I really highly recommend that. Highly recommend that book as well. It's kind of focus on coaching and sales coaching. So like, how do you operationalize those insights from from data-driven sales management? And so, Michelle, I know that you have a really awesome presentation here for us today on Agile sales forces, but maybe you can give a little bit of background to the audience on your work, and then we can get into the presentation.
Sure. Thanks, Pete. I'm just honored to be here with you today with your Revenue Excellence Summit. So thanks for inviting me. So I've done a significant amount of research in the area of sales management and overall sales productivity. We decided as an organization about 13 years ago that we were going to serve underserved populations within the sales force. So we started with sales managers. We did a lot of research, original research in that function, wrote several books about that, and have a passion around helping enable frontline sales managers and leaders. And as we were continuing down the research path, we encountered some research that was taking place at Florida State University that was fascinating and very much aligned with our philosophy of not only serving underserved populations, but doing it in innovative yet highly practical ways. So although a lot of our prior research has been in the area of sales management, the research we're going to be talking about today originated at Florida State University Sales Institute, has been validated and then expanded by VantagePoint, and I'm super excited to share about it. So let me know when you want me to dive in, Pete.
Go for it.
Okay.
I'm pumped to hear this.
Perfect. Awesome. And so, Pete, I'm notoriously bad at monitoring chat and questions. So if you
I can be in charge of that.
Please be in charge of that, or else people will feel ignored, and I don't want that to happen. So
I'll be your wingman here. You drop the knowledge, and I'll manage the chat.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So let me start with the primary reason that sales leaders and sales enablement leaders, even sales operations leaders, they're confused. Because when they want to improve the sales force, the number of choices at their disposal is just mind-boggling. And so this research institute at Florida State University, they have a consortium of companies that get together every year, 40 global companies. And their question for this one particular series of studies was, is there a best methodology? And if so, what is it? Because this is when Challenger came out, and that was all the new rage, and before that, there'd been spin selling and consultative selling. And, you can just see the number of books that I have on the slide. And that's just a small selection of what's available out there. So they launched into the biggest sales methodology research study ever conducted. We got wind of this research and partnered with them to actually make it commercially viable and bring it to the sales enablement market as a whole. So I'm going to walk you through that journey, that research journey, again, that was started by Florida State University Sales Institute and then adopted and expanded and validated by VantagePoint. So the first research study was, is this Challenger thing real, right? The Challenger sale came out and all of a sudden everybody wanted to be challengers. And so the leader said, is Challenger really a thing? And so what the Florida State University Sales Institute did initially was to replicate that Challenger research. They asked sellers to self-identify which type of seller they were, and they were able to validate that high-performing sellers were more likely than everyone else to identify as either Challenger sellers or consultative sellers, where low and average performers were more likely to identify as relationship sellers. But something really interesting happened, Pete. And what happened was that after that initial study, one of the salespeople that was part of the study contacted the researcher and said, I had a real hard time answering your questions. You asked me to tell you whether I'm a challenger or a consultative seller or a relationship seller. And the answer is, it depends. And so the researcher said, maybe I'm asking the wrong question. Instead of asking them what type of seller they are, we should give them different situations and see how they would respond to that. So the next study was an actual situational study. And they gave 3 different sales forces in 3 different industries, 3 very unique buying situations that were industry relevant. And they had each seller analyze the buying situation and then identify what they would do from a sales perspective in that situation. And so there were some really interesting findings from this, because what they realized is that the highest performing sellers are agile. And I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes. So what does it mean to be agile, and how do high performers differ from everyone else? The third study that they did was they said, okay, well, if high performers are agile, does this agile or adaptable approach actually lead to higher win rates? And the answer was, well, yes, indeed it does. And finally, the last question they had was, well, how can we reliably collect and analyze deal level data so that we can get these types of insights for the clients that we work with? How do we gather and analyze information about the buying situations and the strategies that win so that we can codify some of these findings in a more practical, executable way? And that's really where we got heavily involved in this research, in bringing it into VantagePoint, bringing it out to the public at large, validating it and expanding it. So here's some of the just key research conclusions. So on average, a salesperson within any given sales force faces between 4 and 6 unique buying situations. And even for sellers that are in the same industry but with a different company, those situations are somewhat different. There's 4 selling approaches or patterns of selling that high performers exhibit, not one. So this whole idea of getting a standardized methodology kind of flew out the window with this research, because the answer was, well, there is no best methodology. In fact, the best sellers out there pull pieces and parts from lots of different methodologies to form these 4 patterns of selling behavior. So the high performers, in their case, the situation they faced drove their strategy selection. But for everyone else, they use the same approach in every situation. So if they were taught consultative selling, that's what they used. If they were taught value selling, that's what they used. Your core performers and your low performers, surprisingly enough, were the ones that were most likely to actually use what you taught them in sales training, right? The high performers, they take what they need and they leave the rest, right? So these research findings were pretty innovative and different than what anyone had actually come up with before. So now all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, there is not one best methodology, it depends. And so there was this whole idea of agility. So high performing sellers are agile, they're adaptable. They don't stick with one path, they adapt their path based on what they face with a customer opportunity, right? So to be agile, it means to adapt your behavior based on the situation an individual is facing. And here's a really interesting part of that. When we started to explore, well, how do you become agile? These findings were really interesting, but the research team went out and they looked across the sales training industry to find what companies are actually teaching this. And guess what? They didn't find any. So, they didn't find any. Nobody was teaching sales agility.
Not surprising. I feel like the 101 is like, hey, first we got to get everybody like marching to the same beat, which is hard enough, and then the 201, kind of like the double black diamond skiing, is like, okay, now we can help people start freestyling. So, not surprising it would be so scarce in the market there.
And there was a lot of 101 and 201s, but none of them had to do with agility. They were like more advanced views of the same thing with a few different tweaks.
Challenger plus.
That's right. And so what this research team had to do in order to determine, well, how do you actually train people to be agile? They looked at domains outside of sales, right? They looked at the military, they interviewed military leaders. They looked into sort of some of the military history around training, especially around fighter pilots. We'll talk about that in just a minute. They interviewed some people within trauma centers, with first responders. How do you prepare these doctors and EMTs and all those types of people to be agile in the moment? They even interviewed some professional and college sports teams. And what they learned was pretty fascinating. They learned that regardless of domain, whether it's sports, whether it's medicine, whether it's the military, there's really 3 components to agility. And I'm going to use a military example here to how they prepare fighter pilots. So these 3 components are situational intelligence, situational readiness, and situational fluency. So what does situational intelligence look like for a fighter pilot? Well, they gather data on previous engagements. They actually keep logs called dope logs so that they can capture and learn from each kind of encounter they face. Now, what the military does is they take this data on previous engagements and they take a look at what are some of the best fighter pilots doing when they encounter this kind of situation. And they use that insight to create standard operating procedures. This is what the best of the best do when they face this sort of situation. So many of the flight simulators and things like that you see today are based on situational intelligence, and then standard operating procedures. And then for fighter pilots specifically, once the data on previous engagements has been determined and studied and standard operating procedures have been developed, they then train and drill on these standard operating procedures within a framework that they call the OODA loop, which stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And it's a decision-making framework that allows fighter pilots to use these standard operating procedures in a very agile and rapid way during different engagements. So these are the three components of agility with regard to fighter pilots. They're the same three components with regard to first responders, the same three components regarding training quarterbacks to be agile and be able to call audibles, right? So there's some similar themes that really flow through all of these domains, including sales. So how does this align with selling? And how do these unfold, these three pillars unfold from a sales perspective? So when the Florida State University Institute, the Sales Institute did original research, they identified that on average, there's 4 to 6 unique buying situations. And they evaluated over 25 different customer factors or buying factors. And when we started to really gather significantly more data, like thousands and thousands of different deals and analyze those deals, what we found is all of these buying factors really cluster into these 5 buying situation categories, these factor categories: problem awareness, the competitive landscape, customer dynamics, the buying process, and solution definition. We narrowed it down from over 25 to 17, and those 17 really clustered into these different factor categories. So sellers that really want to become more agile, they need to do a better job of really digging into these buying factors to then orient that buying situation, just like the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, and decide. So when we expanded on that research, we not only found that these 5 categories were in every single buying situation to differing degrees, but there's individual factors within these categories that have an outsized influence on how buyers buy from any given sales organization. And I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later in the presentation. So this whole idea of understanding buying factors so that you can assess the buying situation and make sense of it. Well, then what about situational readiness? How do you actually determine what the best sellers do in different buying situations? And this is where really we go back to the research. And there's a really excellent book by Chip and Dan Heath. I don't know if you've read it, Pete. It's called Switch: How to Change When Change is Hard. Have you read it?
I have not, but
you haven't.
That's I love the subtitle.
Yeah. They also wrote a book called Made to Stick, which is more about marketing. They're both fantastic books.
Oh yeah, I've read that one.
Yeah. So the only reason I bring this book up is because what they recommend is that when you're looking to make changes, in order to shrink the size of the change, you need to look for bright spots. And bright spots are examples of what's already working. So when we think about standard operating procedures, when we think about determining what the best sellers are doing, that's where the research comes back into play. But we're going to have a little fun. Before we actually get into some of the research findings in more detail, I want to do a quick poll. So I'm asking you a question. Is consultative selling dead, or is it still alive and well? What's your opinion on that? Inquiring minds want to know. So Pete, are you launching the poll?
I am.
Here we go. Good.
Ta-da.
Okay. So take just a minute and give us your opinion. Is consultative selling dead, or is it, or heck no, it's still alive and well?
The host and the panelists can't vote. I just tried to vote.
No worries.
I wasn't allowed to vote.
I actually get this question oftentimes when I do this presentation. I keep hearing consultative selling is dead. Is that true? Yeah. So I thought, let's just ask and see what people have to say. So are you getting a lot of responses? How are we doing?
I think we're good to go here.
All right. Let's see what turned up.
I think Nora can share. Here we go.
Okay. Heck no. Okay. Heck no. Okay.
Heck no.
So most of you say no, consultative selling's not dead. Of course it's not dead. And you know what? Guess what? You're right. So when we explored what high performers actually do, when they face these different buying situations, what the researchers found is that they don't display one pattern of selling behavior, they display 4 patterns of selling behavior. There is a consultative pattern, and it is alive and well. And there's a disruptive or challenger pattern, and it's alive and well. There's also a competitive pattern and a financial pattern. So these 4 patterns really are culminations of bits and pieces of all of the stuff that's been out there for a while, but combined in ways that that actually demonstrate what high performers do. So we know that there's 4 to 6 buying situations that sellers face in any given sales force. And there's these 4 patterns of behavior that high performers use when they're selling. And they use the situation to determine which pattern is going to be more effective. So how do low performers differ than high performers? Well, when low performers were given different buying situations, they said, okay, well, in buying situation 1, I would use consultative. Oh, in buying situation 2, which is very different than buying situation 1, I would also use consultative. You see where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we contrast that with what the high performers did, it was pretty fascinating because they said, okay, buying situation 1, this is pretty straightforward. The person's open to collaborate. It's really early in their process. I'm going to use a consultative approach. Buying situation 2, there was a bit of a blind spot. I needed to reframe this person's thinking. I'm going to use disruptive. Buying situation 3, there's a strong desire for a financial business case, for ROI. So I'm going to use a financial approach. And in situation 4, there was known competitors, and it was really, narrowing it down to the few. And then, of course, the dog and pony show. So this was the competitive. And so how do sellers determine when do I use these different approaches? Well, as we've expanded the research, what we found is in addition to unique buying situations that each seller faces, there's some overall archetypes that we identified within the data. And these 4 primary archetypes, you can see the first one, the customer has a blind spot around a problem or cause or a solution or a potential loss. And we would say strongly consider using a disruptive approach there, right? Because you need to reframe the buyer's thinking. When the customer trusts your company as a partner, they know what they want to maximize their budget, strongly consider a financial approach. When they know exactly what they want and you're on the short list, a competitive approach. When they have pain, but they're uncertain or unaware of the root cause, they're open to ideas and collaboration, a consultative approach. So that gives you a bit of a big picture view of when do sellers typically use these different patterns of behavior. And this is something that sellers can get their heads wrapped around. It's practical.
It totally is. I'm thinking of so I have 8 AEs right now, and I'm thinking about a variety of recent disco calls that I've either watched or been on. And it really is fascinating. You have customers who literally don't know that they have a problem. They have huge problems. They're just totally unaware of it. And so you have to be wake up, right? Here, I have to elucidate this for you, right? Versus the ones, I mean, obviously the customers who have pain but are they're aware of their pain, but they're not aware of how to solve it. Well, that's fantastic. That's what we all want.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Where it's oh man, can you help me, Michelle? Can you help me fix it? Why, I'd be happy to, right?
Yes.
But it's, I think, being able to identify which situation am I in right now so I can call the right play.
That's
Right. And I like how you guys have broken it down such that it's not 16. It's 4.
No.
It's 4.
Yeah.
Which of these are we in right now?
Well, so you bring up an interesting point, Pete, because we stayed out of the salesperson training business for a while because it was a very crowded market, and we didn't feel like any of the solutions were that innovative, quite frankly. They were 1,000 different flavors of vanilla. And we thought, we're not going to get into that part of the marketplace unless we can do something innovative based on research and that works, that's proven to work. And when we came out with this, one of the first pieces of feedback that we got was, I can't teach my people 1 methodology, and you're going to tell me I got to teach them 4?
Exactly.
Are you kidding?
Exactly.
You not know my Salesforce? And so I understood the concern, but it was a bit of a misnomer because if you look across these 4 patterns, there's only 12 tactics.
Yeah.
And most consultative selling methodologies or individual one-size-fits-all methodologies have far more than that, right? So they try to design a methodology that fits in every circumstance, which means it doesn't fit well in any circumstance, right? So learning these 4 patterns is actually simpler than learning a lot of individual sales methodologies because we've kept it down to what we call the minimum effective dose, right? We want to give you the minimum of what high performers do to get the outcome you want, not overcomplicate it. So it's interesting that you bring that up because we face that in the early part of educating customers about this approach.
Yeah, minimum viable, disruptive, minimum
That's
viable
right.
consult.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Yep. Yep.
So the next question, of course, that people are probably wondering is, okay, I like this idea of agility. I like that you have these 4 situation archetypes. That makes sense. I generally understand that, when to apply these different patterns. But there are cases where customers want more precise insights. They don't just want to know, generally speaking, how do I uncover buying factors and make sense of them? They want to know which buying factors matter most to our buyers and are most predictive of changes in seller behavior. What if they
Sure.
want that? And so we actually can do that. And that requires a combination of both machine learning and deal level data. And let me talk about both of these. We use machine learning because we're looking for patterns that are not necessarily linear. So we're looking for sometimes surprising, unexpected, and nonlinear relations within the data.
Yeah.
Now, if you take a look at deal level data, you're probably thinking, oh my God, are they going to export this from my CRM? Because I got some bad hygiene in my CRM. And everyone does, right?
Everyone does.
There's always questionable hygiene in the CRM.
It's a
So
hot mess.
what we've learned over time is that the real challenge is mining the information, mining the gold that's in the heads of your sellers. That's the challenge.
Yep.
Right? That's what every organization's trying to do. So
Yep.
we've developed a way to use surveys to collect very granular deal level data on both the customer situation and the sales tactics used. And we've developed an algorithm that uses machine learning to analyze that data to give some really interesting insights. And I'm going to walk you through what those are now. So machine learning actually helps identify predictive patterns. That's why they call it machine learning. So if we analyze any particular client's deals, we have to analyze at least 100 deals to get this type of insight. But we can identify predictive patterns. Within the buying factor categories, what are the 5 to 7 buying factors that are most influential to the buying situations your sellers face? And then we can also identify, for each of those buying situations, which pattern of selling behavior is most likely to lead to a win and which one is most likely to lead to a loss. So we're able to get some really interesting insights. And so it's most interesting when you actually take a look at a real example. So I'm going to share with you an example from one of our clients who will remain nameless. When we analyze the data, the deal level data within these 5 categories, we identified the specific factors within each of those categories that had the strongest influence on shifts in seller behavior. So research experience, number of competitors, number of potential departments they could have worked with, initial engagement stage, and role of the decision owner. For this particular client, those 5 factors had an outsized influence on the buying situations their sellers face and the likelihood of seller adaptation of their behavior. And we use this algorithm then to analyze these buying factors into unique buying situations. And for this particular client, there were 4 very different, very unique buying situations. And we gave them fun names: focus project, tell me, educated executive, crowded room. And so this is really interesting, not only for sales leaders and salespeople, but for marketers, right? Think about, this makes marketers' socks go up and down because, oh my gosh, now not only can I talk to my people about buyer personas, right? I can now talk to them about specific buying situations, and I can develop collateral and assets to help sellers sell in each of these buying situations. So we identify the factors, we analyze those to determine how many unique buying situations are your sellers facing. And then this is the super cool part. We're able to analyze. So if you see the names on the bottom here, focus project, tell me, educated executive, crowded room, they represent those 4 unique buying situations.
Scenarios.
Right. So when you see these 4 bars, that just shows you what's the prevalence of each strategy over here on the right that was used by their sellers in each of these buying situations. So here's what's interesting. If you take a look at focus project, you can see that the least used strategy, which was a disruptive or challenge-oriented strategy, the least used was the most optimal. Oops.
As evaluated by as assessed by win rate, I would presume.
Yes, absolutely. We take a look at the tactics used, and then we correlate those with wins or losses. And so this way we can identify which pattern of selling is optimal and which is least optimal for any given buying situation. So this client had really committed to a consultative approach.
Sure.
And you can see in 2 of their 4 situations, that was the optimal approach, but not on the other 2. So only 50% of their buying situations was consultative selling optimal. In one of them, it was a disruptive approach, and the other, it was a competitive approach. So they got really keen insight into how do our buyers buy? What are those buyer preferences? And what does it mean about how my sellers should behave? How do I guide them on how they should behave if they encounter this kind of buying situation? So you can imagine.
It's funny to see, even though this client was committed to consultative, you can see that, at least based on how I'm reading it, the competitive methodology is the most prevalent.
Well, think about how people are trained, right? The vast majority of training that sellers receive is product training.
Exactly. So, like, oh, we have this feature, they don't have that feature, et cetera, et cetera. So they're just revert that. So I think what we're seeing, what's funny here is like what we're seeing here is like this organization hadn't even gotten to the 1.0 of actually standardizing on their anointed sales methodology, which is consultative. But even when they get there, as you can see, that doesn't work with Focus Project. It doesn't work with Educated Executive, right? It only works with Focus Project and, or excuse me, Tell Me and Crowded Room.
How am I doing time-wise, Pete? How much more time do I have?
You're jamming. We got 20 minutes.
20 minutes.
Great.
Okay, good. All right. So the next question you can imagine that we get, Pete, is, all right, so how do I know how effective my sellers are at executing these different tactics within these strategies? And we have another element of our algorithm that actually can identify relative capability in these different areas. And what I mean by relative capability is when a seller uses more of this tactic, does it increase their chances of a win? And you can see we have a heat map here for this particular client. And you can see that their highest capability, of course, was in consultative selling, but disruptive was a big one too. And you can see they've got a huge opportunity here. And what this allowed them to do, what it allowed them to do is not only understand where their biggest skill gaps are, but how do I prioritize my enablement? If I'm going to really do a deep dive on these strategies, how do I prioritize which ones to hit first and why? So this gives them, insight that they can utilize in a variety of different ways. Okay, so we've talked about situational intelligence, those buying factors and how they form unique buying situations. We've talked about situational readiness. What do the high performers do that lead to better outcomes? And the last piece we're going to take a look at is situational fluency. How do we actually equip sellers to be agile, right? How do we execute against this information that we've just shared? And I'm gonna have a little fun with the audience, Pete. I'm gonna show them 2 pictures. And I'm gonna guess that nobody knows who the guy on the left is, and everybody knows who the guy on the right is. So Pete, do you know who the guy on the right is?
I think I do. It's Malcolm Gladwell.
It's Malcolm Gladwell. Yes, it is. Ding, ding, ding.
Ding, ding,
Malcolm
ding.
Gladwell, yes. And so Malcolm Gladwell is super famous for not only being a really good writer, but he takes other people's research and makes it very digestible and easy to understand, right?
Sure.
So he wrote a book called Outliers. And Outliers was the story of success. It was the story of what do high achievers in any given domain, what do experts, how do they become that way? Whether it's music, whether it's sports, whatever it is, how do they become experts? And Malcolm Gladwell is the one that made popular Anders Ericsson's research. Anders Ericsson is the guy, he was, when he first did the research, I believe he was still at the Florida State University. He's a researcher into expertise and written several books on expertise, a little academic, but great insights. And he's the one that came up with the 10-year, 10,000 hour rule. If you want to be an expert, it typically takes 10 years and or 10,000 hours of a certain type of practice we'll talk about in a few minutes. So what we're going to talk about now is how do you gain expertise in sales and why is experience not always equated to expertise? So I'm going to give you an example. I'm a golfer, Pete, and I like to golf. This is me. This is my golf swing. And for those of you who don't golf, you might think, oh, that looks great.
Yeah,
but not really.
That's me.
Right. So
looks good.
I've been golfing for over 30 years. It's a long time. And I shoot in the 90s, which is respectable. Not great, but respectable. The bad news is I've been shooting in the 90s for about 20 of those 30 years. So in my case, experience does not equal expertise, right? So just because I have 30 years golfing doesn't mean I'm an expert golfer. I hit a plateau after a while. So you contrast that with this woman on the right. Do you know who that is, Pete?
No, but she looks really good.
Yeah, her name is Nelly Korda, and she just won the Olympic gold medal for golf in the Olympics.
Damn.
She's a professional golfer. I've been golfing longer than Nelly's been alive, right? But she's an expert and I'm not. So just because I have experience doesn't mean that I'm an expert golfer. And the same is true for sellers. So Anders Ericsson, excuse me, came up with this sort of continuum of what it takes to gain expertise. So think about everyday skills like driving and walking. Once you learn them, you don't think too much about them. You probably even drive somewhere and don't even remember the drive. All of a sudden you're pulling into work and you're like, holy cow, I barely remember the drive.
Yep.
And then there's other things where we apply some effort, we get to a certain level of skill, but then we plateau. And Anders Ericsson calls this arrested development. So my golf game is a prime example of arrested development, right? Contrast that with Nelly Korda's golf game, and she has expert performance. I guarantee you that she approaches the game of golf very differently than I do, right? And so you're probably
got some data-driven coaching going on for her.
That's right. That's right. It's all about being data-driven. So what does this have to do with sales? So you can think of it this way. Everyday skills are sort of foundational selling. How do I open up a sales call? How do I ask questions? How do I talk about my products? How do I gain the next step? Those are very basic, fundamental, foundational things that once we learn them, they become more automatic.
Yep.
And then we learn some consultative selling tactics, maybe even 4 or 5 versions of that. And typically, Pete, that's where we tend to hit that arrested development. We get really good at one type of selling and we rely on that for everything. And the difference is that those sellers that really reach that expert performance and outperform everyone year in and year out, the ones that actually exhibit agile selling and these 4 patterns of behavior, they challenge themselves, and they challenge themselves fairly regularly. And so Anders Ericsson came up with this path to expertise. And he said, not only do you have to practice, you have to do what's called deliberate practice. And deliberate practice means you have to have a clear, specific goal. In this case, it could be understanding buying factors and assessing the buying situation. Focus or apply effort on that goal. Get feedback, real-time feedback. And then this last point is really important. Push beyond your comfort zone. That's what most of us as sellers, we don't do, right? We want to be experts, but we don't want to push beyond our comfort zone because we don't want to feel stupid. We don't want to take a risk of failing. But high-performing sellers, the ones that outperform everyone else, they're curious. And they're always pushing those boundaries. They're always pushing beyond that comfort zone. And Anders Ericsson says, if you do this regularly, if you can practice your craft deliberately and get good feedback in coaching, and then up your level of practice, you're going to get better. And you're going to go right through that arrested development that many of us hit.
A friend of mine who is a partner at First Round Capital had this really great tweet the other day where he was essentially saying, what is the equivalent in your discipline or your craft? What do you do that is the equivalent to a musician playing scales, right? That repetition, and that but intentional repetition too. Like I'm not a musician, but really stretching your hand, really making sure that you're nailing XYZ versus going through the motions, which can be really tough because it's uncomfortable to get outside of your comfort zone. And then the other thing too is that if you don't prioritize sales training, so one of the things we do on our sales team is we break apart our one-on-ones into one-on-ones of the kind of like coaching and performance capacity versus deal strategy. Because if you don't prioritize those the space on the calendar, one of the phrases we use in our organization is the calendar is destiny. You're not going to try to practice on a live op.
That's right.
Because it's like, oh my gosh, I should push myself beyond my comfort zone here and potentially lose this $10,000 commission. Yeah, how about not? Right?
Well, and see, the problem is most of our practice is on the playing field, right? If you look at professional athletes, professional musicians, they practice the basics and the foundational stuff all the time. They run drills all the time, right?
Yep.
And they watch game tape of the competition. I mean, they do so much preparation that when they get on the playing field, they don't have to think so much. They can just act, right? And most training companies do not approach training that way, right? So we're one of the first companies that are actually approaching this whole idea of creating sales expertise through deliberate practice over longer periods of time and increasing levels of difficulty, right? And
You
that's
mean
just,
sitting in a conference room in a hotel for a day and getting
yeah,
talked out? It
that's
doesn't
not it.
stick.
Doesn't
Oh,
stick.
interesting.
Yeah,
Weird.
I know it's highly disappointing. Okay, so if we want to be situationally fluent, if we want to be expert sellers, we want to be agile, what do we practice, right? If we're going to do deliberate practice, what do we practice? Well, one of the ways we can think about is we can take a look at first responders. What do they have to practice and why?
Mm-hmm.
So first responders, very much like fighter pilots, right? They go through a very specific path. The first thing they have to do is assess patient symptoms. You go into an emergency room, the first thing they're going to do is assess your symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Then they're going to have to choose amongst all the treatment options, which one makes the most sense based on these symptoms that I've observed. So they need to assess the symptoms, make sense of them, and then choose and then execute that medical treatment. But then they have to get some feedback. They have to see, how's the patient doing? Is the patient responding? Is it working? If not, I have to do something else.
Yep.
Well, so not surprisingly, it's the same thing sellers have to practice.
Sure.
How can I assess the buying situation and make sense of it in order to choose the pattern of selling behavior that is most likely to lead to a win in that situation? Whether it's unique buying insights based on machine learning or one of those 4 situational archetypes, right? How do I make sense of what I'm seeing? Not make quick conclusions, but make real sense of what I'm seeing, choose the right path, and then execute the tactics within that path. And then guess what? You have to monitor buyer reactions, get feedback. What's changed? Maybe I need to shift my strategy. Maybe I need to deploy a new tactic, right? So it's this constant decision-making and execution that the most agile sellers do. It's not like they choose a consultative path and say, I'm going to execute this throughout the rest of this opportunity. The next step is going to be more consultative, but if things change in this buying situation, I might have to pivot to a financial strategy and build a business case, right? That's what the most effective sellers do. So that's what the most effective sellers practice.
I could see this also almost getting, not to add too much complication, but almost kind of modifying on a per opportunity contact basis.
Yes.
Where you might have somebody who's like, a champion who's super pumped on what you're talking about, is like very, very aware of the pain, and then maybe a level higher, maybe 2 levels higher in the organization, that person has so much distance from this practitioner here that they are not aware of the pain, right? And so you may need to like really disrupt their mindset,
right.
and reframe them, because otherwise they're going to be like, you know what, this doesn't seem like that much of a problem to me.
That's right. You're absolutely right. And so what we help salespeople with is always be assessing, because things change.
Yep.
And you have to understand what's changed in order to be able to respond accordingly, right? We
Yep.
can't expect buyers to adapt to our sales process. That is ludicrous and highly ineffective, right? We have to be constantly tuning into our buyers. What's going on with our buyers? What's changing? What does that mean? How do I make sense of that in order to select the next best path? And then how do I stay tuned to that and monitor their reactions so that I can make sure that I'm on that next best path or where I need to pivot, right? And be agile.
Yep.
So how do sellers that are exposed to this sort of learning path to gaining sales expertise, how do they respond? So this is an actual quote from someone who went through one of our programs in the last 12 months. And she said, I've been doing sales since I graduated from college. I've attended over 20 sales trainings. This is the best by far. Because they're jaded, right, Pete? They're jaded. How many times can you go through a sales training program that teaches fundamentally the same things with a slightly different twist and get good value out of it, right? So this is actually teaching a very different skill. It's not a foundational skill, right? It's more of an advanced skill that once you have some of that foundation in place, you can actually then pivot and take that to the next level and gain that agility expertise. And so what can organizations expect when they deploy this sort of approach? I've got 3 different company examples with 3 different sets of outcomes. So it depends on a lot of things. So company number 1, 6% increase in seller productivity, 7% increase in customer recommendations. Company 2, 8% increase in sales revenue, 10% increase in margins when the industry was flat. Company 3, 39% increase in revenue per seller. So some pretty powerful outcomes. And of course, it can be very industry specific, very marketplace specific, very region specific. But what we do know is that sellers that are agile and tune in better to their buyers outperform sellers that don't. And organizations that adopt this more agile approach outperform organizations that don't. So if you're on this this webcast and you want some more information, there's a couple things that you can do. I've done a pretty in-depth webinar on how machine learning is changing the game of B2B sales. You can put this link in your browser and get there, or you can read our white paper on building an agile sales force, again, by going to the link that you have here. Contact me directly or go to our website. We'd love to hear from you. So
This is awesome.
Yeah, that's it for me, Pete. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I mean, this is like very reminiscent. As you're talking about this, there's a lot of kind of intuitiveness to it. Like, hey, read the room,
Yes.
right? Who are you talking to? And there's like that on a persona basis where it's like, hey, are you talking features to the CFO? Because what the hell are you doing, right? Because she doesn't care, right? But then there's kind of like and that's just like, talking to the relevant buyer or what have you. But then also, it could be organization wide as well. Like the organization cannot have a perception that they have that problem, and so they need to have their mindset reframed. Or alternatively, like it probably is, it's very reliant on the solution that you're selling. Like my background is in selling new disruptive technologies where oftentimes either an organization doesn't know that they have a problem, and so you have to reframe them, right, using a disruptive approach, or they understand the pain, that they are aware of the pain, but they're not aware of like the potential solution path. But that's not the case for everything. Like, if you sell a commodity product, right, and literally what you're doing, and there's lots of competitors in the marketplace, guess what? Like, it just turns out like the buyer will be way more educated about that. And so trying to do a disruptive approach there, that just be like, what are you talking about? Like, this is concrete, right? Like there's like 6 different bags of concrete here. Stop telling me that like yours is going to change my life, right? I would just like to understand why it's like, way more valuable. Yeah, I think this is like super fantastic. And I think that, I'm seeing this as tied to my reading that I've been doing of your book, Crushing Quota, and how the manager has to deploy this.
That's right.
Where you observe what's going on with this rep. Like literally half an hour before your presentation, I was on a deal strategy call with one of my reps, literally talking through the situation. One of the things that I try to help my reps understand is like, when they come to a deal strategy session, or when they're thinking about the op, it's like, what is the state of play, right? Where are the personas at? And so it's kind of like that quarterback kind of going like this, and like seeing where the linebackers are, or in the case of the fighter pilot or whatever, but like, and then being able to articulate that and say like, here's this person in this situation, here's this person in this situation, here's this person in this situation. Based on that information, now what's our next best action? So sometimes like helping the reps like even be able to like bring that information into their brain, like put the cards on the table, or the Legos on the table, if you will. So then they're like, oh, well, now that you made me go through that, it's pretty obvious I need to do X, Y, Z. It's like, yeah, but just, and as a manager, helping them go through that, so then in the future, those brain pathways are way more fluid, is something that can be really powerful.
Yeah, and if managers aren't asking about it, sellers aren't necessarily thinking about it, right? So like those deal strategy sessions are a perfect example of how really good sales managers coach their people in ways that drive this agility, right?
Yeah.
Asking about those buying factors. How do you know? What do you still not know that you need to know about the competitive landscape, for example? So it gives managers a frame for having really in-depth, really effective deal discussions.
Yep. There was a question here, Michelle, regarding some of the findings that you shared. What kind of, could you maybe give a little bit of detail on like the sizes of those sales organizations, like the ASPs, and kind of the size of the size of the field organizations?
So
and what have you?
the original research that was done by FSU, they had over 3,500 sellers in 3 different organizations. Actually, each study was multiple organizations. So when you add them all together, it's probably over 10,000. We've then expanded that research with another, let's see, I'm just trying to do the numbers. total so far, we've got about 25,000 data points in the overall data set. We have not done analysis of average selling prices. So I couldn't really give you that on the fly. I'm sorry, but can you repeat the question?
Well, just how big were the organizations in question? Is this something that can be deployed for like a 50 seller organization, or are we talking like, 5,000 seller organization?
Yeah, so you can deploy agility in an organization of any size. The difference is if you want the more precise insights, you can't do the machine learning with less than an analysis of 100 deals. So we analyze one win and one loss per seller. And so an organization, if you want those real precise insights, you need a minimum of 50 sellers to be participating. But smaller organizations, we teach sales agility all the time, and you don't have to have the machine learning to learn agility, right? So yeah, an organization really of any size can learn sales agility.
Wonderful. Hi, Gina, you're back. That was pretty awesome, huh? Oh, you're muted, homegirl.
Classic.
Classic.
I'm back. Thanks so much for point guarding, Pete. And a huge, huge thank you and kudos to Michelle for your amazing keynote session. I know that everyone who joined today definitely learned something that they're going to take back to their organizations. And don't worry, everyone, we're going to share those links with our follow-up. You can find them on our website. So what's next? We hope you'll join us for our next event in an hour. We're going live with Tanner Lacey of Spiff and Will Foley of Brazen, who will discuss why your commission structure is costing you revenue and how to fix it for 2022. So here's the agenda with the link to the Zoom, plus all of the links to the Zooms for tomorrow's events. And we hope to see you there. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye. Thanks, Michelle. It was awesome.
Thank you so much.